Hello, and welcome to Part 2, Lecture 3 of the Marlborough Intro to Medieval Studies course. We'll be talking about religious reforms in the 10th and 11th centuries. These include a variety of monastic and papal reforms both, some of which will culminate in the Crusades, which I will talk a little bit about as well. Now, if you remember the last time we talked about the 10th century, we talked about the question of the level of violence and how does one measure the violence in society. What does it mean for there to be no central political power? We mentioned Otto I, but other than the German political center there was not, particularly in southern France, Italy, much of Spain, there was no centralized government in any form, and so things very much devolved to the local. And into that space step a number of church reforms. We see other types of movements, particularly in the monastic setting, which we'll talk about in just a second. But one of the most prominent is the peace and truce of God that we talked about. And that might be an indication of how violent society is. It might be the church simply reforming its practice and relationship to violence. Now, it was begun officially in 989 at the Synod of Chartreuse, which is one of the primary documents that you can read online. The peace of God is meant to prevent violence against peasants and clergy specifically, to some extent against peasants, mostly against clergy. It demands that clergy not carry weapons. It is meant to take the clergy out of the realm of warfare to some extent. So it does other things than what we talked about, limiting the free exercise of violence that we talked about in the previous lecture. This is in Aquitaine, which is important, central southern France. The truce of God, correspondingly, sets out days and times of the year when Christians are not supposed to fight each other, right? The peace of God limits where and when and who can fight. The truce of God principally limits when. There are certain days when nobody is supposed to fight and you should be pious. While this is used as a sign of just how violent things are, there are also real theological questions. The church's relationship to violence and whether the church should exercise any sort of violence is one of the things that is at issue. Now, this extends to, in the legal realm, one of the things that is common in the 10th century, and particularly before the 10th century, are trials by either ordeal or combat. Combat is obviously violent. Ordeal, picking up a hot rod, or a number of other walking across fire, things that are meant to challenge the body. The church begins to step away from those and begins to look more and more towards legal practice as a way of resolving disputes, as a way of answering questions within the church as well. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, at the other end of this time period, they will actually ban all church participation in trial by ordeal or trial by duel. But that's something that you see beginning to come about in the 10th century. Now, as I mentioned, the peace of truce and God are declared in Aquitaine, which is important. Aquitaine is one of the hotbeds of particularly monastic reforms, starting early in the 10th century, but continuing through the 11th at least. And just a brief discussion about monasticism more widely. Since its creation, Christianity has had monastic ideals. It has sometimes had very ascetic ideals. We mentioned briefly the Eastern desert fathers and mothers who would literally go out and live alone or in very small communities in the desert, being totally excerpted from society. Simon the Stylite is one of the famous ones, who sits on top of his pillar for long periods of time. The West also has a number of monastic traditions, some coming out of Italy. When Ireland is converted in the 6th century, Ireland produces some very ascetic and quite rigorous monastic rules. The Rule of St. Columba is also available online in the list of primary sources. And you can see in Columba a certain asceticism. There's one line where he actually says, "Be thou always naked in imitation of Christ and the apostles." And he might actually mean just not wearing anything ever, but he certainly means not using any display or any nicer clothes, right? This is part of the monastic ideal is the clothing that you wear, and we can all think of monks in their habits. The habit is meant to be as much not ostentatious display as it is the uniform of a monk. The major monastic reforms, not reforms exactly, but the major monastic practices that come to dominate much of the medieval period come out of the 6th century. The most famous one is the Rule of St. Benedict. And the Rule of St. Benedict is a moderately lengthy rule. It is meant to govern every day and every interaction in a monastic setting, how people interact with one another, the prayers that you say. He is the one who says we should say the book of Psalms on a weekly basis and divides up on which day you say which psalm, so that every week you are saying out loud every one of the 150 psalms. But the other thing that he says, and one of the reasons that his rule might be so popular, is that it's not that hard. And he says, the Psalms is a great example. He says, well, we know that the apostles would read the entire book of Psalms every day. But we are not as great as them, and so we will strive to do it once every week. And there are a number of things where he says you should fast completely on fast days, but if you are weak, you can have water or chicken broth or bread. And there are allowances for human weakness within it. So it has some flexibility. It doesn't feel quite as draconian as either the rules, sometimes informal, but the practices at least of the desert ascetics, or even of some of the Irish monks and the Irish rules that come out of that time period. So Benedict's rule catches on, and by the 8th or 9th century, there are literally hundreds of Benedictine houses throughout Europe. It has superseded the rule of many other local houses. It is far and away the most popular, and remains really the most popular single rule throughout the entire medieval period. There are other types of monasticism that crop up, and we'll talk about some of the new ones in the 12th century next time. But Benedictine houses and the rule of St. Benedict is the major undercurrent to all monastic thinking throughout the entirety of the medieval period. And as we'll see, in the 10th century, one of the ways that people reform, one of the models of reform, and this is true in both monastic and papal circles in this time period, is that reform is not seen as putting out something new, but as going back to and reviving something that worked well in the past that is degenerate in the present. So the abbey houses of Cluny, that's exactly what they say. They say, well, monks are not following the Benedictine rule as precisely as they should. The rule lays out when you can and can't speak, what you should read at meals, and all of these details are not being followed. People are being lax. So the Cluniac reforms are specifically geared at going back to and following more closely the Benedictine rule rather than actually superseding it. And this is true of all of the monastic reforms that we'll talk about. The House of Cluny is founded in 910 by the Duke of Aquitaine, and this is important. This looks a lot like the emperor putting in a pope who he thinks won't be quite so terrible a pope that we talked about in the investiture controversy. It's also in Aquitaine, as I mentioned, the source of the peace and truce of God. The Duke of Aquitaine founds the monastery and gives it a lot of land and basically a big endowment. And the idea is that the endowment is meant to make it possible for the monks to not have to worry about secular concerns. The idea is that with the income from the lands donated by the Duke, that they can live out this rule of St. Benedict in real perfection and not get too caught up in other aspects of needing to control a bunch of peasants or worry about income or clothing, that it is meant to support them and that they are then going to pray as rigorously as possible, keeping to the Psalter, saying the liturgy every day. And as you'll note, this original donation by the Duke of Aquitaine, the charter, in that primary source, he actually says this is meant to relieve them of all obligations except the obligation to pray, and that is now the most important of those obligations. And if anything, this is the one break from what the Benedictine rule describes. The Benedictine rule describes a house of real agricultural self-sufficiency. The monastery is supposed to be separate enough from society that they can grow and produce all their own food, that they are not reliant on, in any sense, the income even of outer society. And Cluny is a little bit different because of this endowment model, although it is meant to up the amount of time that the monks themselves spend praying. Another reform that comes about slightly later, but is based on the same set of ideals, is the creation of the House of Citeaux. And eventually its daughter house, Clairvaux, becomes really the most important of the early houses, although very soon after, Clairvaux and Citeaux will have dozens and dozens of monasteries throughout Europe and becomes actually one of the most powerful monastic organizations in the 12th century. Particularly under Bernard of Clairvaux. He's known as Bernard of Clairvaux. He actually enters the Cistercian houses in 1112, 3 years before he founds Clairvaux. But he's already known as a prominent thinker and monk. He's a major preacher. He becomes one of the major preachers of the Crusade. Very influential church leader and abbot in the 12th century. He is counted amongst the doctors of the church. He's actually known as the mellifluous, or well-spoken doctor, because his preaching became so famous. He's one of the early reformers who pushes for what will eventually become canon law, this more legalized view of the church. He himself founds many, many monasteries, and Citeaux goes from just that single monastery to, within only 50 or 60 years, having 70 monasteries, many of which are in France, many of which are in this area of Aquitaine, as I mentioned. Clairvaux then goes on to found many more. And these monasteries, what Citeaux does to Cluny, Cluny had done to the Benedictine rule, right? Cluny comes into existence and says, well, sure, everybody's Benedictine, but they're not following it strictly enough. And the house at Citeaux, which is originally founded by Robert, who is the son of a noble of Thierry and Ermengarde of Champagne. He's at the monastery of Molesme, and then he moves to Citeaux because he feels like, although Molesme, which is a Cluny monastery, right, they're dependent on, they're a daughter house of the original Cluniac monastery founded in Aquitaine by the Duke. He thinks that they are now too degenerate and not following the Benedictine rules sufficiently. So he moves to Citeaux. He's actually sent back. They request the Pope, they send him back. He moves back to his original monastery, but then back to Citeaux again. He wants to reform and find a way to again live the Benedictine rule more purely, which is what Citeaux and Clairvaux and the Cistercians. Citeaux and Clairvaux, those two are the most important monasteries, particularly, as I mentioned, Clairvaux under Bernard of Clairvaux. The group is known as the Cistercians, just to be clear about that. And there are still Cistercians around today, and actually there's a subgroup of them called the Cistercians of Strict Observance, and more popularly known as Trappists, which you may have heard of. There are still Trappists. To some extent, they're most famous. The Trappists in Belgium make very well-known beer. Trappists in New England are, I guess, known for making jam. That's what you see most frequently. But they are a strict version of the Cistercians. They rarely speak. They take vows of silence for much of the year. This doesn't mean the liturgy. This doesn't mean they aren't singing and intoning psalms every day, but they barely speak outside of that. And you can see here, this is the Abbey Church of Fontenay, which was founded by Bernard of Clairvaux himself. Even their aesthetics are very, very plain, right? You don't see the sort of ornamentation that you see in cathedrals that are starting to be built at exactly the same time. You have a much more austere setting, blank windows, limited use. There is still glass put in them, and sometimes stained glass, but a much more limited use of stained glass. and in all ways a much more austere outlook on the world. And this is the feel of the monastery that they move around in. Now, the last place that I want to mention, founded right around this time period also, and also a response to supposed Cluniac degeneracy, right? And you see this pattern, right? Cluny is the reformer in 910. The Cistercians are the reformers almost 200 years later, not quite 200 years later. And around the same time, actually just before the founding of Citeaux, there's the founding of the Grand Chartreuse, the Carthusians, in 1084. And it's called the Grand Chartreuse. It's in the Chartreuse Mountains in southern France. And the house itself is extremely isolated. Here's a view of what it looks like up in the mountains. It's really impressive. They also are going back to the Benedictine rule, taking vows of silence, trying to lead a more austere life. One of the interesting pieces about the monastic life this way, they're entirely non-missionary, right? They don't even really relate to cities and towns around the monastery. It's very introspective. And that's part of the goal of what all of these reforms are trying to build, are places where that can be true, where the people in them only pray and lead these introspective, very private lives. Now, this obviously isn't true of everybody. Bernard of Clairvaux, as I mentioned, preaches the Crusade. He's known as a preacher. He is known as a theological thinker throughout Europe. And he actually has a fair number of letters. So there is communication going out of them. And to some extent, it depends on the individual character of both the monk themselves, but also the character of the house. The Carthusians are much more isolated even than the Cistercians are. And the Cistercians go back and forth. There are some groups of Cistercians who want them to be more isolated, other groups that are a little bit more engaged in the world. So that's a brief overview, at least, of some of the monastic reforms of the 10th and 11th century. I'm going to review just a little bit some of the new papal ideologies that come out of the same time period, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Crusades. The papal reforms I'm not going to talk about very much because many of them get covered in the discussion about the investiture. If you remember, here are some of the early key figures of the investiture. And as I mentioned, it starts out with a series of basically terrible popes, people who are raised in the city of Rome. They become Bishop of Rome. They don't necessarily have a lot of communication outside. The worst offender is Pope John the 19th, referred to by one of the reformers later as a demon in the disguise of a priest. He resigns once. He sells the office. He's driven out by Henry III 2 different times, in part because the popes that get sent down from Germany tend to die of malaria. But at any rate, eventually the Emperor Henry III decides that this is enough. The office should be a more sacred office. So he brings down a group of people who he installs in the papal office and as assistants to the Pope, who will become Pope Leo IX in 1049. He's appointed at Worms in Germany, and they begin as pilgrims and arrive as pilgrims. And one of the things that they bring with them are these new monastic ideals, right? One of the people who goes to Rome with Pope Leo IX is the Abbot Hugh of Cluny. He's coming from the house of Cluny. He's coming from this more austere view of how the Benedictine rule should be followed, and believes that this is something that can benefit the whole church. So you see right from the beginning a major leader from the Cluniac expansion, now just 140, 50 years after the founding in Aquitaine, coming to Rome to inject these ideas into the church as a whole. Hildebrand, who later becomes Gregory VII, who we talked about, one of the major movers in the investiture controversy, he himself is also a monk from Tuscany. Peter Damian, who's probably the most fanatic of the reformers, as I mentioned, he actually refuses to enter a Cluniac house because he thinks that living in such a big house is too luxurious. So he actually becomes a hermit instead. He writes in 1050, he writes this screed, basically, called the Book of Gomorrah, as in Sodom and Gomorrah, And he condemns everything from masturbation and homosexuality to clerical marriage, any sort of marriage within the church. And as I mentioned before, priests getting married, being in the secular clergy rather than the monastic clergy, tended to be much more elastic, and I mean, one way to view it is more lax. But with the entrance of these monastic ideas into the church as a whole, they begin to pressure any church official, certainly, to act as if they were a monastic person, even if they are not actually in a monastery, right? Bishops are not generally part of monastic houses. This is also in part where the real attack on simony, which is the buying and selling of offices, which in some respects is not surprising given John the 19th's behavior, but attacks on simony and particularly marriage, right? Celibacy until this point is a monastic ideal, and so it is the appearance of the monastic ideal that tries to make everybody in the church celibate in a way that they weren't necessarily before these changes. It also fits well with a universal Christianity that is espoused by Cluny. There is a right way for all people to be Christian. And the monastic ideal is the highest ideal, and that's something that they bring into the church. And that's something you see all the way through with the reformers, right? There are several reformers who, in this battle of the investiture, what they suggest as a compromise is that the bishop actually be taken out of any of the running of the land, that all of the secular business that bishops previously engaged in that required the ring, the money that they were given, the benefices that came with being a bishop, that all of that should be removed from the bishop's official duties, because really the bishop should be more of a monastic, celibate, clerical and holy figure whose main job is to pray. You can see underneath this the Cluniac ideals for how church officials, all the way up to the Pope, should really be acting. And I won't go through each of the reformers, but the last little point that I'll make, I mentioned before, Victor II, Nicholas II, Alexander II, Urban II are some of the major popes throughout the investiture controversy. They're all the second because they are looking back to the ancient church. They see themselves as restoring an older Christianity the same way that Cluny sees itself as restoring an older monasticism. For the whole investiture discussion and the particular theologies and actions of some of these popes, you can listen to the whole investiture controversy lecture. It's long and detailed. So this brings us to the Crusades, which itself, if you remember, is also something preached by one of these reforming popes, by Urban II, having a fight with the German emperor, finds himself itinerant in France, and the Crusades might be a way to drum up papal support, in a sense, that the people, that he can prove just how influential the church is. Now, I see the Crusades as resting on two basic ideological foundations. Now, obviously, this is contested what exactly the Crusades mean. There's a very long bibliography and discussion about why the Crusades happened when they did, how they happened, what their meaning was for people who participated. But I see it as resting on two main foundations, and one is the militarization of church aims in the world, coming through the peace of God movement. And you remember I said that the initial declaration of the peace of God in the 10th century, it only contains negative language. It says that the threat of excommunication is leveled against anybody if unjust war existed. If they are committing war, there's such a thing as legal war. And the idea of legal war actually goes back to St. Augustine. He is one of the early formulators of when is war just, when is war unjust, what are the situations in which you can fight other people. Because there is an attempt, Christianity has a lot of statements about what it means to be a peaceful person and pushes towards peace, but there are also times when it is acceptable to be bellicose or warlike. There have always been provisions for allowing war, particularly against disturbers of the peace, and this is something that you see continued in the peace of God. People who break the peace of God are threatened not just with excommunication, but potentially with military action. And as I also mentioned, there are some times and places when this actually becomes the church, or you see bishops setting up militias that will go out and fight people who have broken the peace. Now, there's a massacre at the Battle of Benicy, which I mentioned before, in 1038. The archbishop actually suffered a defeat, and so they thought, maybe this isn't something that we want bishops doing. And it was also interpreted, because the archbishop is defeated, it was interpreted as the repealing of God's grace from those who had broken the peace themselves. So it was seen that, well, perhaps by waging war, that was a breaking of the peace. And so the updated language from the Council of Narbonne in 1054, we warn and command according to the law of God and our own, that no Christian shall kill any other Christian, for he who kills a Christian undoubtedly sheds the blood of Christ. So now the peace of God has moved simply from, well, you can't fight in these certain times and places, to you should never fight other Christians, right? It's a further restricting of when violence is legal to be used, and stating that you can never use it on your fellow Christians. Now, obviously that doesn't hold, right? War continues to be fought in Europe by Christians between France and England, and France and Germany and the Italian city-states, and you name it, for centuries. But besides that, one of the questions that is, okay, how much is this the church militarizing itself in the world? And how much is this actually the church trying to limit the amount of violence in the world? But as I mentioned before, one of the things that this does do is, if you are not allowed to fight other Christians, even though that continues to happen, it is still allowable to go and fight non-Christians. This opens a sort of door for something like the Crusades to exist, for groups of Christians to get together to fight non-Christians, right? It draws a line between Christians and non-Christians that before would have been hazier, who you could and could not fight. Certainly the Crusades look very militarized, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the peace of God is something that is supposed to, or that is the involvement of the church in militarized matters. Now, the second underpinning is the renunciation of sins for individuals who fought in church-condoned ways, right? And this is different than the church saying you can or cannot fight in certain times. This is the church saying that there are certain instances in which if you die fighting, we will give you a dispensation for sins that you've committed. We will declare those sins. We will declare a renunciation of those sins if you die in these certain circumstances. Now, this is something that appears before the Crusades. Like the peace of God, this is something that is building up to what actually becomes the specific Crusader ideology. The slightly cynical way to view this is that this is the church convincing other people to fight its battles for it. As noted in the peace of God, Pope Leo IX in 1053 actually used his own army against the Normans in southern Italy when they were annoying him too much. But all of these reformers had an idea about it at the time. Peter Damian, the one who was too fanatical for the Cluniacs, hated the idea of any war on the church's behalf. He maintained that monastic ideal in an extreme form, right? He was a hermit for a long time, living just alone, and felt that the church should be removed from secular politics, so much so that war was not part of his theology. Pope Alexander II formally supported the invasion of Sicily. He sort of gave the invasion his blessing. He also supported the Reconquista in Spain. Alexander II actually said that fighting against the Muslims was following the will of God, and as such did not represent an act of breaking the peace or of sinning. So even under the peace and truce of God, according to Alexander II at least, you could fight Muslims, and that would not be a sin. He explicitly absolved the sins of fighters in Spain, although interestingly, in doing so, he distinguishes between the Jews who had, quote, submitted and the Muslims who had not. So as soon as a religious group submitted, they were then subject to the rules of the peace of God, and you couldn't just wage war on them sort of willy-nilly. Although, as the Muslim kingdoms had not formally submitted, they were exempt from that status. Gregory VII becomes a particularly militarized pope. He actually plans a defense of Constantinople in 1074 and is figuring out a way to send troops there. Although he was a little more circumspect about the granting of remissions of sin, he actually goes out of his way to encourage militaristic practice for the church, although he is not as readily open as Alexander II had been just a few years earlier in saying, well, if you're going to go fight this battle, I will give you a blessing. We will absolve you of your sins up until this point, so that if you die in battle, you can be more assured of entrance into heaven. So these are some of the reformer popes, right, in the 1050s, 1060s, 1070s. And it's Urban II, he preaches the Crusade, as I mentioned, at 1095 at Clermont. Originally, it had been planned as assistance to Byzantium, right, and this mirrors what Gregory VII had been doing in 1074. But Urban II really combines this in his sermon, saying, we are not allowed to fight other Christians, so if you are going to engage in battle, it should be against a non-Christian foe. We will absolve you of your sins now. We will give you papers. This is what become indulgences. We will give you proof that we have absolved you of sins, such that if you die in battle, it is okay. We will give you our blessing to go and fight this battle against the Muslims. In the textbook, there's a fairly good description of some of the exploits that happen on the way to Jerusalem, so I won't enumerate those here. But this, you can see how this ideology is getting shaped in response to the Normans in southern Sicily. It gets used for the invasion of Sicily when in the Muslim parts of Sicily. It becomes part of the rhetoric in the invasion of southern Spain when the Christian kingdoms start to take over Muslim kingdoms in the south. And that's something that will progress very rapidly from about 1100 to 1250. And by 1250, much of southern Spain is in Christian hands. There are a few remaining kingdoms, most notably Granada, right, that actually is there until 1492. But some of those, and Granada is one of these. Granada is actually, when it is finally conquered in 1492 by the Catholic monarchs, it is actually already a suzerain state. It's already paying them tribute. So it's not even at that point a fully independent kingdom. So some of the Muslim states that are left in southern Spain after the so-called Reconquista themselves are already subject to the Christian states in the north. But you can see all through that some of the orders. We've mentioned a little bit about the Templar and the Knights of the Temple, these military orders that are supposed to be religious clubs and actually encourage their members, not unlike the 11th century reforms generally, to live more monastic lives, but to go off to war to do it. And so this is a lighting or combination of some of these monastic ideals and deeper spiritual ideals with a new militaristic expansion ideal. And so you see that in these knightly orders. And Spain has its own, and the most common in Spain at least are the Hospitallers are quite active, although they have other groups that join in this as well. There's Mercedarians, there's the Order of Santiago, and there are a number of these groups throughout Europe. The Templars and the Teutonic Knights are probably the most famous for their respective battles fought in the Holy Land and also in northeastern Europe. The Teutonic Knights, actually, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the Teutonic Knights use some of this same spiritual language and religious purification when they go to fight Slavs, some of whom are at least nominally Christian, right? So you can see this ideology expanding beyond its original bounds. It becomes not just about fighting Muslims anymore, but a sort of spiritual justification for war. I'll talk a little bit more about the knightly orders next time when I talk about some of the new 12th century forms of religious expression, including confraternities and a variety of religious expressions that come about in the 12th century. The knightly orders aren't exactly of a piece with that, but they have many similarities. So, for today, we've talked about starting with the monastic reforms, really going back to the 10th century with the founding of the Cluniacs, how many of these reforms, the Cluniacs, the Cistercians, the papal reforms in the 11th century, where you have a number of people, Alexander and Urban, who are the second, they're looking back to an older form of Christianity and declaring this to be a reforming or that is a going back to or a purifying of an older type of Christianity, right? The Cluniacs are saying that they're doing that for the Benedictine rule. The Cistercians then say that they are doing that for the Cluniacs, who have not done it well enough. The popes of the 11th century bring this monastic reform ideology to the papacy itself, and from there to the entire church by extension. And it is some of this reforming spirit and coming out of the peace of God and combining that with the absolution of sins that eventually under Urban II becomes this new Crusader ideology. So you can see the Crusades and some of the new church controls on the acts of war as coming out of this whole reform movement of the 10th and 11th century.